I edited it. Hello, book lovers, and welcome to the 138th episode of Authors Love Bookstores from a Mighty Blaze. I'm your host, Joe Moldover, and I am delighted to be here with you today. Every week, I crisscross North America along with my partner, friend, and fellow writer, Kimberly Hensel-Lawrence, going to independent booksellers and speaking with them and the authors who love them. And this week, we are, for the first time, supporting an independent bookseller in the great state of South Dakota. My guest this week is author, poet, and teacher Patrick Hicks. Patrick, welcome to the program. Thank you for being here.
Oh, it's a real honor. I just really appreciate being on the show. Thanks for reaching out.
Delighted to have you. For the audience, Patrick Hicks is the author of over 10 books, including The Collector of Names, Adoptable, and This London. He also wrote the critically and popularly acclaimed novel, The Commandant of Lubezek, if I'm saying that correctly. His latest is In the Shadow of Dora. We're going to be talking about that one, as well as his forthcoming novel. In the Shadow of Dora was named a finalist in the Screencraft Cinematic Book Writing Competition. He has also written a great deal of short fiction. His work has appeared in numerous journals and magazines. He's been nominated 7 times for the Pushcart, among other honors. His poetry has appeared on NPR, PBS NewsHour, and American Life in Poetry. And he is the writer in residence at Augustana University, as well as a faculty member in the MFA at Sierra Nevada. Whew, Patrick. And that's the edited bio. So I pared it down. But Patrick and I are here today in support of Zandbroz in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and we are going to be joined in just a minute by bookseller Jeff Dans from Zandbroz. We're going to bring into the conversation.
Hello,
Great.
Jeff. Welcome.
Hey, Jeff.
It's great to see you.
Welcome.
sorry about the technical difficulties on my end.
Your timing is impeccable. I just introduced Patrick and announced that we were going to be supporting Zandbroz in South Dakota. So you walked on stage exactly on cue. Welcome.
Good. Glad to hear that. Nice to see you too.
Well, and you've arrived just in time to hear yourself and your store praised, because I was about to ask Patrick why he nominated your store and what is so special about it.
Well, one of the many things that I like about Zandbroz is Jeff. He's too humble to mention this, but he is a champion for the humanities in Sioux Falls. He really encourages local writers and brings in national writers. So he's got a really good bookstore, but it's also a wonderful sort of outreach to the community. And anyone that has been in Zandbroz, they're just kind of overawed by not just the books, but the other side of the store has all of these, because it's called Zandbroz Variety. So there are a lot of things that you don't realize that you need, but you want quickly. Items for the kitchen, like a mitt that's like an alligator or something like that. And it's just a delight to walk around Zandbroz. There's a lot of sort of whimsical things that are just fun to look at.
And
thanks.
Absolutely. And, this is actually the second time we've hosted Zandbroz. We appeared last year with Sally Kaslow in support of the Fargo store with Greg Dan. So this is, I think, our first time hitting 2 branches of the same store. Jeff, tell us a little bit about the store and about your origin story.
Well, my brother and I have been in business since we were kids. We had a paper route together, and we sold lucky number scorecards before the Twins farm team played in Bismarck, and then we would sell concessions in the stand. And so we've always kind of enjoyed working together. And back in 1988, we both lived in Sioux Falls, and our downtown was pretty much dead. They had put a pedestrian mall in the middle of it, and that was kind of the end. And we spent our lunches looking at old buildings, and we bought an old building and spent a year fixing it up, kind of brainstorming what the store would be. My brother, Greg, worked for Bookman in Minneapolis for many years. And I actually worked for, Bookman was owned by the Stillman family, and I worked for the Stillman family, owned an art supply store. And we both loved Saverin's bookstore on the West Bank. Bill Saverin had this amazing store back in the 70s. And consequently, we both moved to Sioux Falls after living in Minneapolis and St. Paul for a number of years. And what we wanted was to bring all the things that we kind of missed from living in an more urban environment, like a good cup of coffee. There was no coffee bars in Sioux Falls back in 1980, 89 when we opened. So we had a soda fountain, coffee bar, and I guess we were ahead of the curve about being a sideline store. There was no Barnes and Noble in Sioux Falls. There was a B. Dalton store in the mall. About the same time, we opened a very good used bookstore, opened a few doors down from us. They closed, they retired and closed a couple years ago. But the first 10, 15 years without a Barnes and Noble in our backyard were a lot more fun. And we had a lot of activity in the back room where we did author events, and things have changed, but we've kind of enjoyed rolling with the changes, and 39 years later, or 34 years later, we're still here and having fun.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And, I want to remind our audience, our online audience, people who are with us now, people who are with us in future time watching this recording, that we do this program in support of independent booksellers, supporting independent booksellers all across the country. And so we're dropping links for you to be able to head to Zandbroz online and pick up some books, pick up whatever you want. I've been to the website. You can get all kinds of stuff. And pick up some of Patrick's books while you're at it, which we're going to be talking about. So support independent book selling. Patrick, a question for you. One of the things we oftentimes like to talk about on this show, because we're speaking, both with an author and with a bookseller. So we sort of like to talk about genre and sort of the sellability of different types of writing and sort of different niches and stuff. You are somebody who has written fiction, both novel length and short fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. So more than most of the writers we speak to, you wear a lot of different hats. I wonder if you could sort of say something about shifting between these different forms. I read in an interview that you actually have different desks in your office for novel writing and poetry, which I thought was very interesting. So I'd love to hear about that, and also how this all interfaces with the market and actually, selling some books. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, those are wonderful questions. And I'm very multi-genre, but the only genre I don't write in is screenplays. And, that's where the money can really be. I enjoy writing poetry, but it's really hard to make money as a poet. So really, I figure out what genre I'm going to write based exclusively on what kind of story do I want to talk about. What's the story? So when I write about the Holocaust, for example, that lends itself to nonfiction and fiction. Poetry is very individual. So I tend to turn to poetry if I'm writing about, say, my family or my deep roots in Northern Ireland. So it really depends on the kind of story that I want to sort of express and get out there. But you're absolutely right. I appreciate the nod, Joe, to that previous interview, because I do have two desks, and I'm in my office right now, and I'm sitting at what is my poetry desk. But if I can pan my camera a little bit, that's the fiction desk there. So every single novel I've ever written, right there. And in fact, I've turned the screen off, but the book I'm working on right now is queued up. So
that's fantastic. It's very cool. And we're going to be talking about your current and forthcoming work in a few minutes. When we were chatting before going on the air, our producer, Kimberly, I think complimented you on the rows of books behind you, and you referred to them as your tools. Yeah. And in I think a prior interview, you talked about writing as, I think in your words, sort of a working class job. And you sort of said, it's like being a plumber. Like, you don't ask a plumber, like, hey, do you feel like plumbing today? Sort of like, like, are you moved to like go and like fix some pipes? It's like you go and you do it.
Yeah.
And that for you as a writer, it's the same thing. Like you grab your tools, you sit down, you get your words on the page. I wonder if you would sort of say a little bit about that and sort of where you think that comes from for you, because I think that
Yeah.
many people think about writing differently. So I just sort of, have you always thought about writing that way? Is that something you've developed over time? Where does that come from?
I think it's become more clear to me over time. I started some of the first, my earliest fiction. I was 6 or 7 years old, and just trying to figure out how a typewriter worked and whatnot. And then as I became a teenager, it was more for affectation. I write poetry, and when I got to college, I realized, if I want to take this profession seriously, I need to be serious about it. So I think it was really in college that I really began to see writing as a job, and I thought, well, if that is indeed the case, I need to have hours. So I began to mentally think of punching in and punching out, because if you wait for inspiration, you're just going to miss so much, and you do have to sit down and do the work, because sometimes I've been writing and the writing hasn't been going very well, and I have a word goal of 750 words a day, and I do not get up until I reach that 750. And some days go better than others, and when it's not going well, often, not always, but often, something will happen and a scene or a character will appear or dialogue will appear, and then suddenly everything just opens up. And if I wasn't at the desk, waiting for inspiration, then I never would have had that scene. So that's why I have a word goal. So I do it not by chronology. I do it by word goal. So 750, sometimes that takes me 90 minutes. Sometimes it takes me 2 hours. Sometimes I can get up to 3,000 words in, 3 hours. So that's what I mean about not waiting for inspiration. For me, I think writer's block is a crutch. I came to my office today to write, and outside my window right there, it is a gorgeous day in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. But I got up and came to work.
Yeah, I mean, just like the plumber's got to go fix the pipes, even if it's a gorgeous day.
Yeah.
Jeff, will you say a little bit more about the literary community in Sioux Falls? I mean, you talked about it back in the 80s. You were founding the store. Weren't coffee shops you couldn't get a decent cup of coffee. Patrick is there now. I imagine that a great deal has changed over the last 30 years.
Yeah.
Give us a little bit of a sense of kind of like what's happening and maybe sort of what role your store has played in it.
Well, there's always been a lot of local poetry, and we had a lot of fun poetry readings. Probably for the first 20 years, we had a lot of events in the store, and about the time I always kind of peg it with 9/11, we started to see attendance was not as good, and it was tough to build an audience. So we started doing more book signings than author talks. And lately we've been trying to do things with the public library here in town. They have a great facility. They're terrific at marketing their events. And so these days we're doing more off-site stuff. But back in the first 10 years especially, there were so many great regional writers. This is before Patrick's time. A lot of Minnesota writers, John Hassler, Frederick. Have you ever heard of Frederick Manfred, Lord Grizzly? He was quite the figure around here.
And in fact, I'm in his old office.
Okay. Did you ever meet Frederick, Patrick?
No, he passed away before I came here. But I'm friends with his daughter and fellow writer, Freya Manfred.
Right. Freya would tell you she's a better poet. Anyway, John Hassler, Ann Sullivan, Bill Holm was a dear friend and read here frequently. And then a few great West River writers, Linda Hasselstrom, Dan O'Brien. We really had a lot of terrific events with those folks. In fact, Linda Hasselstrom's first reading was in our store, which I didn't realize. And her daughter was there, and they hadn't seen each other for many years, and she didn't know her mother was a writer, and that was fun to see. But nationally, Sioux Falls has always kind of been out of the national tour routes, but we had some fun people here over the years. Molly Ivins was a Pistol. George McGovern, our local favorite son, was scheduled to read with us, and then Random House called us up and said, Senator McGovern is going to do his Terry book signing out at Barnes & Noble. We didn't know you had a Barnes & Noble in Sioux Falls. And I wrote George a letter saying that you are much loved here, and there's time for you to do a book signing on Main Street as well as out on 41st Street with Barnes & Noble. And he answered us back, and Random House called me up and said, you must have big friends. And I said, no, in South Dakota, we talk to each other. But George had subsequently did, I think, five book readings with us. He was writing a lot of books. At the end of his life, he was still out with a book about Abraham Lincoln that, he would call me up and to reschedule something, and I'd hear all this noise in the background, and I'd say, where are you, George? And so I'm at University of Oklahoma, because they called me up and asked me to come and talk. But we had a lot of fun in the early years with readings. One of my favorites was the guy that wrote Dances with Wolves, which was a big hit for South Dakota. It built a lot of tourism, but he wrote a book called Marching to Valhalla about Custer's last journey and the letters to Libby, his wife. And he came here dressed and performed dressed as Custer and read these letters. And but these days it's few and far between that we have those opportunities. But when we do, we try to do them with the public library or South Dakota Humanities. Patrick has done a few things at Augustana that we've been fortunate to sell books. And Patrick has been great in bringing his fellow authors that are passing through. Steve Wingate, a terrific book called The Leavers, I think. Patrick has also created a lot of activity here in town recently. He and a friend, John Locke, have edited and put together a book called The City of Hustle, Story of Sioux Falls. And how many contributors, Patrick? Like 40?
Yeah, 50.
50? Yeah. And just covering every aspect of Sioux Falls history and culture and life. And it still continues to sell well, and was a fun experience for a lot of people like myself who got to write a little bit about Sioux Falls.
Very cool. Very cool.
Also learned what a great editor Patrick is when he took my work and made it a lot better.
Yeah, we're going to link to that book in the chat for people to get a copy from the store. Patrick, speaking of some of the local authors and such, Kathy, who's with us over on YouTube, says, I believe Patrick has a John Hassler story. I don't know if you're going to, I don't know. I'm just putting that out there.
Yes. In fact, I have many stories, but I won't get into. The short version is I was John Hassler's student, and he, as an undergraduate, he taught me fiction, taught me how to write fiction. And John Hassler he's a huge presence in Minnesota literature, but in the 70s, 80s, 90s, up until his death in 2007, he had a national presence. I mean, he came to the White House at least on 2 occasions because the Clintons loved his work. And John taught me so much about how to be a writer, and also how to be an author. And what I mean by that is how to give back to the literary community, to help the next generation. And he helped me understand the value of generosity, and helping the next group of people that are going to be writing. And that he was just such a wonderful example. He spent a lot of time with me as a 22-year-old. And I thought I was a good writer, and then John would sit down, and I realized I'm really pretty bad. But he did it in such a gentle way.
He was a sweetheart. We had a speaking engagement with an organization here in town, and when I saw that he was coming here to speak, I asked him if he would do a book signing while he was in town, and he said, "Yeah." And then the people who had a contract with him for speaking said, "No, you're not doing it." But he came in and apologized. He felt so bad, and he set another date with us, and he and his wife came back, and yeah, he's very generous, really sweet man.
Yeah.
Patrick, a lot of the people who watch this program are themselves aspiring writers and love craft stuff. You've already shared some people love the 2-desk thing, by the way. Let's see, I think now everybody wants 2 desks. We're going to run on desks. Susie, watching on Facebook, wonders, do you have conversations with your characters while you're writing?
Oh, wow. Wow, that's a great question. I suspect that maybe Susie does. And that's one of the things that I just love about writing, is that we all have different approaches, and not one is right, not one is wrong. I don't have conversations with my characters. If anything, when the writing is going really well, I feel like I'm taking dictation. And that's like with the first draft, first draft, worst draft. And then I really dislike doing the first draft. For me, the joy is rewriting, is the second draft, the fifth draft, the 10th draft. That's when I really come alive.
Right.
And it's at that point that whenever I read the dialogue, I'm kind of obsessive about my dialogue. I will read that out loud just to see, does that sound natural? Does that have the right cadence? I'm thinking about, if I'm writing American characters, I'm thinking of regional dialect. And so I guess I don't talk to my characters, but they do talk to me through their dialogue.
That's great. That's fascinating. Yeah. I'd love to say a few words about a historical fiction, if we could, because, Patrick, your 2020 novel, In the Shadow of Dora, is one of those pieces of historical fiction that is just kind of conceptually a little bit mind-blowing. We're linking to it in the chat, but it is a novel about the intersection between the Nazi rocketry program, the Nazi weapons program, using forced labor in concentration camps, and the NASA Apollo programs and the post-war effort to reach the moon.
Yeah.
And it is, so I wonder if you would just say a few words about the book and your process with it, because I think it's just one of those pieces that I think is just even getting a thumbnail of it is just kind of eye-opening.
Yeah. So that's it there, In the Shadow of Dora. So it sounds like I almost made this up, and it is fiction, but the historical underpinnings are absolutely accurate and correct. And there is a real life connection between the Holocaust and the wonderment of going to the moon. And that's rooted in the Nazi program, the V2 rocket. And the V2 rockets, that was the very first ballistic missile. And it was developed by the Nazis, and they were built, the V2s were built in a secret underground Nazi concentration camp called Dora Mittelbau. And the Nazi scientist, Werner von Braun, would be the most famous. They knew that their technology was so rarefied, they knew that either the Soviets are going to get them or the Americans are going to get them. So they kind of willingly gave themselves up to the Americans, and our nation essentially said, we will not charge you with crimes against humanity, which we absolutely should have, because tens of thousands of men died in Dora Mittelbau. We said, we will not charge you with crimes against humanity if you come to the United States and you build us the most advanced rocketry the world has ever seen. And that's exactly what happened. So part one of In Shadow of Dora takes place in Dora Mittelbau. And readers have told me they've never read an account of a concentration camp that made them feel like they were actually there. And then part two, my character Eli, he survives. I'm not giving anything away. It says that on the back cover. He comes to America because he's lost his whole family in the Holocaust, and he gets his doctorate in astrophysics, and he finds himself working at NASA. And part two takes place on the eve of Apollo 11 taking off. Mm-hmm. And my main character Eli, Jewish, finds himself building rockets underneath, bureaucratically speaking, underneath the same men who were his tormentors at Dora Mittelbau. So, and we can certainly talk about craft. I write about the Holocaust a lot. So part one was fairly easy to write, at least from a crafts perspective. From an emotional and human perspective, it was not. And part two was surprisingly difficult. I'll just end by saying this. As I was writing the first draft, I thought, okay, I'm into part two. This takes place in the 60s. It's my country. It's my history. This is going to be easier to write. And after a page, I just came to a grinding halt because I realized, but I'm looking at my history through the lens of a man that survived the Holocaust. What would he think of civil rights, the Vietnam War, the Beatles? So I had to change. It was really much harder to write part two than I ever thought it would be.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. Jeff, I'm going to sort of pivot from that to sort of asking you like a crass market question, which is tell us about sort of historical fiction's place in the market. Are people, or is it at this point, do you find historical fiction like this to be a fairly sort of niche in the market? Does it have sort of mass appeal? Is it difficult to find a place in the market for work that is tackling something that is so difficult and that, as Patrick says, can make you feel like you're in a concentration camp? I mean, how do you respond to this from a bookseller point of view?
Well, I think there is a strong interest in historical fiction. It's one of my favorite things to read. What it competes with these days is escapist fiction because the times we live in. I find myself spending a lot of time reading the news and the New York Times and the Washington Post. And so at bedtime, pulling up something that's totally foreign to the world and environment we live in. But at the same time, when I look at the bookshelves in my store and when I look at what sells, historical fiction and just straight up nonfiction probably are, I see those two categories kind of morphing into each other, and we probably sell as much of that as we do of fiction, and particularly in hardcover, because the nonfiction stuff tends to be timely. Patrick's books, I remember the trials as a kid and asking my dad about, the pictures of the Holocaust that were everywhere when that trial, when the Eichmann trial was going on. And I remember thinking when Patrick's book, The Commandant, came out, do I want to read another book about the Holocaust? And I started to because I like Patrick's work and I like Patrick. And so I read it, and it really resonated with me. I mean, it and then The Shadow of Dora, I was, okay, you're still writing about the Holocaust, Patrick? But it was brilliant. I mean, I knew vaguely about the U.S. bringing in those people and how important they were to our program, but I just didn't know the specifics, and the way Patrick put it together with the character that had suffered under Dora, and to be part of that was really great writing. And I find myself recommending fiction more than nonfiction, and escapist fiction more these days, because that's what a lot of people are asking for, is just something a good summer read. But I think it's still a strong category, and I think if you look at the bestseller lists, it kind of bears out.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Patrick, apart from novels, and I will be asking you about your forthcoming novel, but I think one thing that's also sort of notable about your work is that, as I said in the intro, you have 7 Pushcart nominations. Your work has been in Plowshares, Missouri Review, Georgia Review, Prairie Schooner, Alaska Quarterly, Guernica, New Reader. I wonder if you would just sort of say a few words about the market for short fiction, because I think that a lot of kind of up and coming authors are, will sort of cut their teeth kind of trying to place short stories or flash fiction, maybe essays. And, it's kind of a funky market, and it's one that you seem to have mastered. So I wonder if you would just sort of say a few words about your experience with that.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I'm always delighted with the privilege of being published by someone. I mean, it's just wonderful when someone believes enough in the work that they and you know what this is like, Joe. It kind of depends. I tell my students, because I teach creative writing here at Augustana University, and I tell my students that it's easier to get a poem published than a short story, based purely upon how much real estate it's going to take up in a literary magazine. A poem is like 1 page. So I tell my students, like, look, maybe you might want to start with poetry, and then you can build up your publishing credentials. And I am not saying poetry is easier. All I'm saying is, it takes up less space. But if you write a short story, that short story might eat up anywhere from 10 to 15 pages in a literary magazine that is maybe 100 pages. So your chances of getting a short story published are just naturally harder because you're competing against, the space. So I just tell my students that, you have to be persistent. You have to get used to rejection. It's a part of the job. I said, you have to like rejection like it's chocolate. You just have to, just let it roll off your back and just send out the work somewhere else. Yeah. And as you know, Joe, you have to know what kind of magazine you're submitting to, because not all magazines are the same. And I always want to make sure that my work, if I've labored on it, I want my work to be in good company. I want my story to be, with people that I can tell have also taken it's obvious that they've worked hard on something, that care has been taken.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. No, and that it's going to be in a venue that's going to take good care of it. That's going to sort of, put together a good product, and that you're going to feel good about the way that it's kind of put forward into the world. Yeah, absolutely. Do you use...
And if I could just sort of add on to that, because if it is in a place that really cares about it, it can maybe, have a life beyond that literary journal. I'll give you a quick example. I wrote an essay called "In the Ruins of the Third Reich." It's like, what is it like to walk around Berlin today? And I take the reader, it's nonfiction, and I take the reader to where the different parts of the Third Reich happened, the Führer bunker and all these kind of things. And I just found out today that it's going to be included in like a book on, on craft, how to write well. And I doubt that would have happened if I hadn't placed that in a really good quality literary journal in the first place.
Yeah, that's fabulous. Well, congratulations. That's fabulous. And, you mentioned in passing sort of venues for poetry and sort of getting poetry out into the world. So I do want to mention poetry from Studio 47, which I believe is ongoing. Is that correct? That's...
We've taken a hiatus for a couple of months, but happily I'm on sabbatical for this coming academic year, so I will be gearing up and getting more episodes, and that airs every Friday on South Dakota Public Broadcasting, which is our NPR affiliate.
Fantastic. Yeah, we're linking to that in the chat. Patrick, you've been putting your time to good use with that. You've got a new book coming out in September, I believe. Are you able to tell us anything about it?
Yeah, I'd be delighted. I mean, I'm just thrilled it's coming out in September, because it's about 4 years of work. And my first novel, The Commandant of Lubezek, my second novel, In the Shadow of Dora, they're both about the Holocaust. And as I was finishing In the Shadow of Dora, I realized that I haven't really talked much about gender. And I was wondering, well, how if you were a woman, what would the Holocaust look like? And there was an all-female concentration camp called Ravensbrück, which was just north of Berlin, and it was the largest concentration camp just for women. And I began to wonder, well, did the female prisoners act differently than the male prisoners? Did the female guards act differently than the male guards? And the answer to that question is yes. So the novel is called Across the Lake, and it comes out in September. And it's a braided narrative where one of the characters is a Jewish prisoner and the other is a female guard. And the female guards were even more brutal than their male counterparts because they felt this need to sort of prove that they could do the job. So I took a deep dive on gender and the Holocaust. And for that reason alone, I'm really pleased that the book is coming out, because it's the very existence of the story, I think, is going to prompt people to maybe ask questions about gender and violence.
It's fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. We're coming to the part of the show where I'm going to talk about some other books, and in particular, we're going to sell some books. So for the online audience, and now and in future time, get ready. We're going to make some recommendations, and we're going to be linking in the chat for you to pick up any of these books that sound good from Zandbroz. Jeff, you're the professional among us, so I'll go to you first. What do you recommend? What's hot right now? What are you excited about this summer? Just out, forthcoming. What can you recommend to us?
Well, I am recommending more older books than I am newer books these days.
That's fine.
And part of that is because I'm the old man in our business, and so they keep me upstairs in the office. I do payroll and all the paperwork for both stores, and so when I go downstairs, and staff kind of keeps me in a corner and doesn't let me get into too much trouble. But no, I have two very good book buyers now, and I should probably have them up here. My wife and her colleague Justin do a terrific job. But I'm big on recommending some older titles. Dave Eggers is a good friend to Zandbroz. We had Dave Eggers here back when the book about the Sudanese refugees.
What is the what? What is the what?
Yeah. And he was just so generous with his time here. He's going to be reading at our North Dakota store in Fargo the 8th of October. Partly to support Fargo's store has been working with the ACLU in trying to counteract the legislative and social political actions to take books off shelves in libraries. And that's happening a little bit in South Dakota too. But I have been encouraging people to read The Every. And if they haven't read The Circle, I think those are terrific books. I think he's the Dickens of our time. We have a regional author, Kent Kruger, who
he's great.
Wonderful things. He's a generous author in that he loves to hit the road and visit libraries and bookstores. His last book, This Tender Land, is a terrific homage to Huck Finn. Can't get the camera angle here right. He also has a terrific book called Ordinary Grace.
Oh, yeah.
I think that if you don't live in Minnesota and South Dakota, North Dakota, the central Midwest, you might not be aware of Kent and his work. He also has a terrific mystery series that he has been doing for about 4 years. Another one that it's a new book, a book on creativity called The Creative Act, A Way of Being by Rick Rubens. This came out a month, 2 months ago. Rick Rubin's is a musician, a world-class interviewer. He has a terrific podcast called Broken Record, and he just started another one. That Broken Record is specifically music, but the other one is about anything that Rick happens to be interested in. But this is a great book for anybody that wants to stimulate their own creativity. It's the kind of book that you can just pick up and open it anywhere, and it's thought-provoking. And when I say stimulate your creativity, I don't mean it in terms of you have to be an artist or a writer or I think just living creatively and living fully. Another book that I don't have up here with me that I'm encouraging people to read is 3 or 4 years old, called Shadowbond, and it's probably one of my favorite books. It's and I'm trying to pull the author's name up to the front of my brain. It's a sort of an apocalyptic road trip, a venture through. Music has disappeared, and this brother and sister driving across the states have this playlist that their dad made for them, and every time they stop in a town, everybody gathers around to hear it. But I'm not really selling that one there, am I? The other things that have been big at the store lately have been the City of Hustle. City of Hustle, it continues to sell. We've had a kind of resurgence of Charles Portis. I'm reading Masters of Atlantis, which is a very old book, but I am enjoying it immensely. It's dabbles with an obscure fraternal organization, and that builds from two guys into a world juggernaut. But he's a funny author. It's entertaining. I guess my lack of being on top of it is got me stumbling here. But
no, it's great, Rex. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll say, just on a personal note, Kent Kruger is a favorite of mine. He's going to be on our show October 4th. Really like, right? He has a new novel, new standalone coming out this fall, and we're going to have him on the show October 4th, which I'm very excited about. I've given copies of Ordinary Grace to pretty much everyone I know, so I proselytize that book.
Yeah, I got a copy, like right about there.
Unbelievable book. Unbelievable book.
When I started reading This Tender Land, it reminded me immediately of a grade school teacher reading us Huck Finn, one chapter a day.
Yeah.
I decided that's how I was going to finish This Tender Land, and I would read a chapter each night.
Yeah, fantastic. Great writer. And his Cork O'Connor mystery series is also, anybody who wants a summer read, you can't do better than one of those mysteries. So that's a blast. And I'll also say we've been after Dave Eggers to be on the show and talk to his people. So he remains sort of the white whale for this program. Patrick, what do you say? Books that you would recommend to the audience?
Yeah, and I thought about this, and I have thought, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to mention a couple of books that had a deep impact on me as a writer, where I read the book and there was something that was happening with craft, or the author made me think of things in ways that I had never done before. And I got to start with Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried, which is just, I read it when it came out in 1990, read it in one sitting, and it just blew my mind wide open. He's a Minnesota writer like me. And since then, I've become friendly with Tim. And the first time I met him, it was like meeting the Beatles. I really had to control myself. He's just a phenomenal writer. And another writer I'd recommend, and she might not be as well known here in the United States as she really would be, but is Pat Barker. and her novel Regeneration. This is a part of the Regeneration series, and Pat Barker is an astonishing writer, and I would love to have a meal with her and just pick her brain. But Regeneration takes place during the Great War of 1914 to 1916. It involves Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen meeting in Craig Lockhart Hospital because they both have shell shock. And this just knocked my socks off the first time I read it, because I had never read historical fiction where you could have a real people from history walking around in the narrative of a story with made up characters. And it was just, and she is an amazing writer in her own right. I've read everything by Pat Barker. And lastly, I'd mention Kazuri Ishiguro, another British writer. I tend to like the British and Irish writers since I'm Irish American, but Never Let Me Go is, I could say it's about clones, but and this is just, anyone that's read this knows exactly why it's powerful. You get really, really close to these characters, and it's just really well done. So I think if you're a writer, you tend to read writing and you're paying attention to craft, where if you're just a reader, you're enjoying the story, which is what you should do. So it's a bit like watching a magician, I think. If I'm a magician, I'm wondering, well, how is that getting pulled off backstage, where the audience is just delighted by the fact that rabbits and flowers are flying all over the place. And I'm like, what's going on backstage? So if you are an aspiring writer, I would really encourage you to think about, if you read a paragraph and you're like, wow, that's really powerful, well, stop right there and try to figure out what made it powerful.
Yeah, fabulous recommendations. Thank you, both of you. The audio, we've got all of that. All of those links are in the chat for people to pick up copies of those books, and fabulous books. It's a complete pleasure speaking to the two of you. It's a great conversation. Jeff, we always wrap up these conversations with a question for the bookseller. And I don't know if Greg gave you a warning about this, but we always ask the bookseller a final question on the way out, and it is fill in the blank that goes like this: success as an independent bookseller is part luck, part hard work, and part what else? What is the third ingredient?
Perseverance.
Yeah, that's great. Perseverance. Yeah. Also, probably, Patrick, you'd probably endorse the ingredient for a writer.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Perseverance. If you give me a student that I'm teaching and they have talent that's here, but they have a lot of perseverance, I'll take that over a massively talented student that's lazy. Give me 10 years and I know which one's going to be successful.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly it. Exactly it. God, thank you both so much for joining me today on our 138th episode. Complete pleasure to be with you. To the audience, please use the links, pick up some books, support independent book selling, and also circle back. We're going to be coming back around in the next couple of weeks. We are getting extremely close to having hit all 50 states, along with DC, Puerto Rico, Canada, and the UK. Only 2 states left, and they're in our crosshairs. We are going to be in Maryland in 2 weeks, and then we are going to be pursuing the final state, Oklahoma. And we are getting close, so stick with us. That is going to be coming up. Patrick Hicks, Jeff Dans, thank you so much for joining us today for the conversation. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
I loved it. Thank you, Joe.
To the audience, thank you both. Thank you so much, and come back next week. Until then, stay well and keep reading.